All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to another in a series of informational meetings DPR is putting on this year to assist you in putting together applications for our grants programs. My name is Jordan Weibel. I'm the Research Grants Program Lead. I'll note that the Research Grants Program is now closed for applications for this year, but our Alliance Grants Program remains open until December 8th. If you're interested in applying for a research grant in future years, typically our solicitation period opens in late summer and continues until early fall. And I'd be happy to field any questions about the research grants program, either here today or via email. Today's session will focus on crafting a scope of work and the pieces that go into that. And those include writing objectives, tasks, and deliverables. First, a little outline of where we're going today. We really want to help you understand the purpose and role of each of the components of the scope of work. I'll mention that, as you can see here, section 3 of our application is comprised of a scope of work and budget. We will not be discussing the budget section today. That's covered by a separate series of virtual information sessions. 2 of those are complete, and 1 of them will be conducted in November. If you're interested in reviewing those files, they're posted to our websites as well. So the items that go into scope of work that we're going to talk about today include the intended audience, the project abstract and summary, and then the team members, and then the goals, objectives, tasks, and deliverables that make up the rest of the scope of work. So what do these terms represent? First and foremost, the scope of work includes broad information on what the project is intending to achieve. This is included in facets like the title and the abstract and the project summary. From there, the project goals flesh out a bit more specifically what the project will do, and the team members are a list of who will achieve them. And then the objectives and tasks describe how the goals will be achieved, and the deliverables and associated due dates provide the evidence that DPR needs to determine that these tasks have been successfully achieved. Who is the audience for the scope of work? So the scope of work is one of the main tools used by reviewers, and these reviewers are both from the Pest Management Advisory Committee, which is a stakeholder group that assists DPR in reviewing our grants proposal applications, and then DPR's internal reviewers as well. And it's important to note that both for PMAC and DPR's reviewers, there's a wide variety of backgrounds and experience levels. So I'm going to touch on a couple points today, including that these documents should be readable by scientific and non-scientific audiences, and that's an important thing to keep in mind as you develop your materials. The scope of work is really intended to show how the project will accomplish its goals and objectives. The proposal application also includes a section of questions 1 through 4, and those lay out a bit more what the project intends to do and some of the framework for the background of the project. Whereas, as you can see here, the scope of work is much more focused on the how. For any funded projects, the scope of work that you submit is used as essentially a prototype in developing the grant agreement that would be formed between DPR and the grantees organization. So in general, the scope of work should follow a couple of format rules. It should use a formal tone and clear language. It should avoid jargon and divide any acronyms used, and it should be understandable to scientific and non-scientific audiences. The first item that you'll encounter when filling out your scope of work is the project abstract. Well, and this is beyond a couple of brief things like the title. The project abstract is a really important tool. It's a very brief statement, 600 characters maximum, that lays out the purpose, priorities, scope, and potential beneficiaries of the project. But I'll point here to this third bullet point in particular. This statement for any funded projects is what gets posted to our partner website at the California Grants Portal, which some of you may have found out about our program through. And this is a really important tool for us to spread the word about which projects were funded and what exactly they do. So the project abstract becomes pretty important. It should include descriptions of the beneficiaries, such as communities, stakeholders, individuals, organizations, entities, and more. Particularly for alliances, this is a pretty broad pool of people that can be described as beneficiaries. So you can think expansively about that topic. And the abstract should be, as you'd expect for a 600-character limit, concise, and it should also be readable for the general public. An example here, and I'll note that all the examples that we're going to be discussing today come from either the sample alliance scope of work or the sample research scope of work. Both of these can be found on the relevant proposal application materials page for both the research and alliance grants program. Those are both easily found on our website. And even though the research grants program is currently closed, I would encourage anyone that's looking for more examples of how to fill out these documents to review both the sample alliance and sample research versions, because a number of the pieces are going to be quite similar. And that actually is even more true for the budget portion of the proposal applications. So here we essentially see a project abstract that has been chopped up to show you how each of these different things are achieved. So a sentence that addresses the purpose. This project will increase the adoption of early detection and rapid response to support the management of invasive plants in California wildlands. And further description of the priorities. This project will reduce the number of pesticide applications and amounts of pesticide required to control them. Some description of the scope. Community science networks will be created by recruiting members of the public, volunteer groups, and work crews, and provided with tools to detect and record early populations of invasive plants. A description of the grant's potential beneficiaries. This work will benefit Californians whose health may be impacted by ecosystems created by invasive plants or the pesticides used to manage them. And then the project abstract is essentially expanded into the project summary, which follows directly after. And the project summary is longer. It's still relatively brief, 1-page maximum, and it should be a more expansive version of the project abstract that serves to form a compelling description of the proposed project. It should also be understandable to the general public and provide a broad overview of the proposed project. It should also importantly include some detail on the relevance of the project to the mission of the department, and it should not explicitly rely on references. There are some materials that are submitted with your proposal application, the key cited documents, and those 5 documents can be referenced at different points in your application. But in general, we don't like to see project summaries that heavily rely on a reviewer going and needing to read a separate reference to understand what's going on in the project summary. So for the project summary, there's a couple notes here on the research grants process. I'm going to skip over this today as the research grants program is currently closed for applications. But if you're curious to review these materials, the PDF of today's PowerPoint will be posted to our website. So for the alliance grants, key details that you want to address, similar to the abstract, the target audience, and geographical area. Importantly, some discussion of the outreach or communication framework that will be used to reach this target audience. And then the potential for the project's effects to be implemented, expanded, and adopted more broadly. And this can entail broader expansion beyond the geographical area the project is intending to serve, but also beyond the timeline of the grant itself. So the more durable, the better. Then some information on any methods that you've devised for measuring the success of the project. And then again, the relevance of the project to DPR's mission. So we're going to dive back into some details from the example provided in the sample alliance scope of work. You can see a note there at the bottom, again, that this can be found on our website in its totality. And as we go through these, I'm not going to read over these in detail each time, but I would just like to highlight them individually as we go through. So again, we see here that there's clear statements that describe the purpose. And if you call back to the project abstract we just looked at, This is relatively similar, but with a broader level of detail. And then the target audience, there's important information here on exactly who the project intends to serve. The geographic area and outreach framework, which we see specific information here on the regions that might be affected. And then measurements of success. And this is a really important piece that can at times be difficult to come up with good ways to implement. So I'd encourage you to think creatively on this one, but also try to have something that is well-founded as a metric. And then finally, the potential for implementation and the relevance to DPR's mission. And if you have any questions about the mission of either DPR or our grants program, that would be something I'd really encourage you to check out our website on. Those details are well laid out and might help you shape your application materials. So then let's move into another category, the team members. And we're going to talk a little bit about the different categories of team members, and in particular, DPR's definitions of these personnel. And some of these things might differ a little bit from how maybe your institution defines these terms. And we don't have any problems with those definitions being used on essentially the grantee end, but we do require that our documents are filled out with some pretty specific use cases here. And the principal investigator is one of them. So DPR's definition here is that the PI is the individual who is essentially responsible for controlling the project. And that is both the admin and financial sides, as well as, especially for our research grants, ensuring the scientific integrity, but also broadly the management of the project. When we talk about financial management of project funds, there are some specific things that need to be done there, including, as you can see, some details about invoicing here. The PI is the one who signs the invoices and approves those. And the PI is also responsible for making sure that the project adheres to DPR's terms and conditions. And this one is particularly important as there are some certification statements you guys are going to make when you submit your applications. And these include that you've read and understood the terms and conditions. So for the PI, that's really important to make sure that your application can meet all of those terms and conditions. PI must personally participate in the project. And there are some cases where co-PIs are acceptable, but I would call those rarer. And I would encourage you to think about project structures that don't include those first. I would call that a last resort if you need it. And then for the PIs, and as we're going to talk about some other personnel, a CV or resume must be provided in the application package. Next, we have essentially the next level down of personnel, the key personnel associated with the project. So key personnel are essentially personnel who, without whom in this specific role, the project could not be completed. And these are individuals that are contributing major portions of the execution of the project. These, just as we see with PIs, do not have to have salaries requested. Often some application packages will include in-kind contributions, but those personnel still do need to be listed. The key personnel need to devote a measurable percentage of effort to the project, which needs to be listed in the scope of work and budget documents. And this does not include personnel like students or other named staff that are not specifically required for the completion of the scope of work. So the example I like to give here is that something like an undergraduate lab assistant who maybe is going to work on the project for a year or so and then be replaced with a similar undergraduate student, those would not rise to the level of key personnel. They're going to fall into the next category we're going to talk about, which is non-key personnel. For key personnel, we also require CVs or resume be submitted, just as with the PIs. And importantly, on that last bullet point, if your project is funded, the key personnel are a category where any changes will require a full grant amendment. And that is a relatively time-consuming process. So I would say it's important to get your list of key personnel correct, or as correct as possible on the front end. Then we have non-key personnel. And these essentially are a bucket for the rest of the personnel that would be involved with the project that are more fungible in their role. People like students or other named staff that are not specifically required for completion of the scope of work. And these oftentimes will be roles that are currently unfilled. So submitting your scope of work and budget documents with TBD for these roles is okay. For Alliance grants, it's important to list all of the known Alliance team members in that team members section. But many of those Alliance team members, depending on their contribution, will fall into either the key personnel or non-key personnel roles. If you want to learn much more about those Alliance teams, and it's a relatively complex topic that is kind of unique to our Alliance grants program, I would really encourage you to review the Building a Strong Alliance Team virtual information session. And the PDF of that slide deck and the recording are both available on our website. So here we see an example from the sample Alliance scope of work. So we see the team members, we see the principal investigator, and a couple non-key personnel associated with her organization, and then 3 key personnel associated with other organizations, and then a couple other non-key personnel that are associated with the project as part of the Alliance team. All right, next, let's move on to goals. And if you remember, our goals, objectives, tasks, and deliverables are all pretty closely related, and they kind of form that pyramid structure we showed on the slide previously. So goals are the most broad of that pyramid structure. They're quite general, bulleted statements about what the project needs to accomplish to fulfill its stated purposes. They need to be measurable and achievable, and they should also be closely correlated with the deliverables as the goals flow through the objectives and tasks to achieve those deliverables. Here's some example goals from the Alliance scope of work. So these, again, as we're reading through these, think about how they're quite general, but also describe well what the project is intending to do. Engage and educate community members and field crews in identifying and documenting observations of invasive and early detection and rapid response listed species through the use of a mobile application. Devise a plan for land managers to verify observations submitted by community members and field crews and implement appropriate control, favoring non-chemical methods. Evaluate and refine the early detection and rapid response program for future adoption. Perform outreach by promoting and demonstrating the program in other regions. And you also might be noticing that many of these are similarly correlated with the project summary and abstract, and kind of distill portions of it into these chunks of the project that then will be completed. Here's some example goals from the research scope of work. I'm not going to read through these as these are a little less relevant to today's audience, but similarly, these materials are available on our website for review. Next, stemming from the goals, we have the objectives. So the objectives are short statements that include a description of the process that will lead to results that will achieve the project's goals. And thus they are more specific than goals. For each goal, you need to have at least one objective and often more. And a note here, objective 1 should remain consistent across all grants, and it should not be modified by the applicant. And we're going to dive into in a second some of what's included in objective 1, but essentially they're all the DPR facing relatively administrative tasks and deliverables associated with the project. So for objective 1, which is conducting general grant admin and delivering either a research plan for our research grants. And this has a number of tasks included, and a lot of these describe the touch points that DPR is going to maintain through the life of the grant, including things like the initial project meeting, quarterly meetings, and annual meetings. Here we see the tasks devoted to the research plan for research grants, but for Alliance grants, which might be more relevant for today's discussion, the outreach plan that needs to be submitted for any funded projects. And I'll note that this is not something that needs to be developed as part of your application package. All of these things would be for the funded projects to provide once the projects are actually executed and have begun next year. Other examples from Objective 1 include the annual reports, and you can see as we go through these some standard formatting for a number of these items, and some of this language is appropriate to use for drafting your objectives and deliverables as well. Things like how the due dates and deliverables are phrased can be good models. And then an example of the final report you see here. And then let's move into some of the objectives that will actually represent what is contained within your scope of work. So for both research and alliance applicants, these would be Objective 2 and onwards. The majority of our applicants, I would say, include somewhere between 4 and 7 total objectives, but your project can have more or less. That might just be a useful barometer for how many to include. I won't read through this research one again here, but similarly, it can be found on our website. And actually, yeah, I don't think we need to dwell on that. Great, so then moving on to the tasks themselves. So tasks are essentially descriptions of how the objectives are going to be achieved. And these are step-by-step work plans. Tasks include things like modeling, experiments, analyses, field trials, meetings, development of training materials, conducting surveys, and much, much more. Tasks either generate data or other end results that they have to generate tangible things that can be used in a deliverable for DPR to review. So tasks are essentially the real how of how a project is going to achieve its goals. Here's an example from the research scope of work. You'll see essentially a bolded statement at the top that broadly describes the task, and then unbolded text that describes the specifics of what will be conducted within that task. And of course, this one is relatively research focused, but similar alliance versions of this are available on our website to review. So when you're writing your tasks, try not to be overly specific. Essentially, think about future-proofing the potential grant agreement that might result from this scope of work, and how being too specific might pigeonhole you in a way that would eventually lead to the need for a grant amendment, as I mentioned earlier. They should, however, provide enough detail to show that there's a clear plan that would achieve the project's objectives. And instead of incorporating a lot of that highly detailed description in the scope of work, that can often be more appropriate to include in question 4 of the grant application. And as I mentioned before, your proposal application includes a few pieces, one of which is a set of 4 questions that require relatively lengthy responses. Finally, a note there that further detail is included in that research or outreach plan, task 1.2 that we looked at for any executed grants in the 2023 cycle. So then moving on to deliverables. Deliverables result from the completion of the tasks, and they provide tangible, specific proof that a task has been completed. As you saw with a number of those tasks and objectives we looked at previously, they often take the form of short reports submitted, whether as an example of a poster that was used to at a conference, or a short report on the data collected, or a report of how a field day went, the list of attendees, something like that. There's a number of different formats that deliverables can take. You'll see some relatively common ones in the sample, alliance, and research scope of works that we provide, but we are quite flexible on the form that deliverables take. 1 or more deliverables must be specified for each task, so they don't need to be exactly 1-to-1. They can have more than 1 deliverable for each task, but each of them needs to have their own due date. Here's some example deliverables. So we see in example 1, the task is from a greenhouse study, and then the deliverable, as I kind of described, a report. And you can see here that this is relatively broadly defined for what it's describing. There's quite a bit of specific detail that would be known to both the PI and DPR's grant manager in this case, but a lot of that detail would end up being included in this case in the research plan. So you can see how these kind of achieve that goal of balancing a specific enough task and deliverable while still having some wiggle room in the case of any needed changes. Similarly, for task 5.3, publishing the results of the project in trade journals, and the deliverable being final drafts of articles submitted to DPR before publishing. Then a note here, for tasks that we are calling linear tasks, basically tasks that rely on the completion of previous tasks, the corresponding deliverables should have separate due dates. So sometimes we've seen applicants listing things that clearly need to be achieved sequentially as being due on the same dates. We like to avoid that just because we like to see proof that a prior task, such as in this case, as you can see here in the example, a field trial is complete and then the analysis would be conducted. We like to get those in successive groups. Similarly, some notes on recurring tasks. If a task repeats, include multiple deliverable due dates for those, and that can be both for things that are irregularly scheduled, such as multiple conferences that the project would like to attend, or administering multiple trainings that are not going to be held, say on the same date every month or something like that. Other things, though, however, could be regularly scheduled. Annual repeats of field trials that will be delivered at the same time, or quarterly summaries of the outreach conducted over that past quarter. Here's an example of one of those recurring tasks. So we see presenting the results at annual meetings for growers, and we see that that would occur in both 2024 and 2025 and be delivered on the same date. This is an appropriate way to write deliverables that essentially cuts down on the amount of text while still retaining all the information we need. Finally, some more notes here. You saw, I think, in one of those previous deliverables that there was a lead time of 20 days for any published deliverables. There was some published materials listed with one of those deliverables. This is a requirement that we actually are forced to abide by. So we do need materials quite a bit in advance. So make sure when you're writing any deliverables that would produce materials like these, that you include that necessary 20 days lead time. Then the final deliverable must occur before the project end date of December 31st, 2025. And that's largely because that final deliverable needs to be included in the draft of the final report. And that final report draft is due a couple of weeks before that project end date. So that's a relatively common error we see people making as well that should be avoided. And then, as we've kind of been describing, try to include a moderate level of detail in these deliverables. The more extensive detail should be included in the researcher outreach plan or question 4 as described. So looking back at kind of a generalized example from the Alliance scope of work here, we see a description of the project, what it would do largely, and then a specific goal that stems out of that broad description of the project, and then an objective that achieves a big piece of what that goal is stating, and then a task that is going to achieve part of that objective and advance the project towards completion of the objective, and then a deliverable that provides very specific information to DPR's grant manager that the task has been achieved. All right, and then moving on to just some general reminders and tips for success here. We talked a little bit about those linear timelines. we do advise people that it can be best to avoid those linear timelines. And I'll say in particular for this year's grants program, where we have an even a slightly tighter timeline than usual. This year's projects would be for a 2.5-year project length. In past years, we've sometimes funded 3-year projects. So if those linear tasks, if preliminary deliverables and tasks end up essentially failing, it can cause big problems for the project. And that can lead to significant delays in the other deliverables and potentially even impact how much of the project is completed. So make sure if you're using things that are highly linearized like that, that you've built in enough essentially buffer that if there are things that come up early in the project, that they can be addressed and dealt with. Make sure to define any acronyms the first time they're used and avoid jargon. And on the acronyms in particular, treat essentially questions 1 through 4 and the scope of work and budget as kind of separate documents. If you've defined an acronym in, say, question 1, go ahead and define it again the first time it's used in the scope of work. Make sure to read the applicable terms and conditions. We have 2 versions posted to our website. I state one here as the University of California, but the UC terms are for both our University of California and Cal State University applicants. And then everybody else would use our non-UC terms and conditions. And one little note there, for any federal or tribal applicants that read the terms and conditions and maybe have some questions about some that they may have difficulty achieving, definitely get in touch with us. And we'd prefer that you get in touch with us before you submit your application. Another great reason to make sure that you've reviewed these terms and conditions well ahead of time and made sure that your organization can comply with them. Make sure that none of those terms are specifically violated in the proposed scope of work. That's something that we've seen. Yeah, and actually see a raised hand. James, go ahead. You can just feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi, sorry to interrupt. I didn't know if you wanted questions at the end or during.
This works.
So I had a question about the deliverable due dates. And
Yes.
does this mean that, so I'm an academic at the University of California, if we get such a grant and we write a report that would be published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal, and this was a deliverable, we would need to submit it to you guys 20 days prior for publication for approval?
So long story short, yes, but really what we're looking for there is we have a few specific things that we essentially can't allow materials that are produced with our grant funds to do. And one of those that's a big one is promoting or disparaging trade names. And we like to essentially just check over that these specific things that DPR funds cannot support are not being done. It would be extremely rare for us to go in and actually try to revise, say, scientific findings or things within your report. Generally, when we're reviewing those deliverables, that's not our aim. It's mostly to ensure that we're complying with all the regulations that we have to.
Okay, I understand. So have you given grants to folks who are affiliated with the University of California before? And has this passed their Office of Contracts and Grants?
Yes, so I'll note that our terms and conditions specifically have been negotiated between the UC Office of the President and the Department of General Services through the state of California. So we have a very specific application format that has been negotiated and agreed upon. And there actually are pretty extensive materials on this format available through the UC Office of the President website. And we have links to those materials, I believe, on our website as well.
Great, thank you very much.
Yeah, great questions. Thank you. All right, excellent. I'm going to dive back in. So we were kind of talking about some of those terms and conditions. And, I included an example at the bottom here of a commonly violated one that often applicants will include travel outside of the state of California. And if that were to be included in your application, we would go back to you and say, you have to remove this piece of it, or else your application would not be allowed to be fully reviewed. So make sure that, you're not going to end up in a situation where a portion of your project does not meet our terms and conditions, because that can be a big headache for everybody. Make sure to proofread the entire document, particularly for things like due dates being mirrored correctly between the schedule of deliverables table and what is written in the deliverables, that things like your task budget add up to the same amount as present in your total direct costs. There's a number of locations where essentially information is placed in 1 or 2 or even 3 locations. Just make sure those all match, make sure that there's not easy errors, because as people are reading and reviewing these documents, those kind of things can definitely cause a reviewer to look at your application more poorly. I would say the more sloppily your materials are more put together, the worse off you're going to be. And remember that all reviewers are going to read this application. You shouldn't include too redundant of information in questions 1 through 4 as you include in the scope of work. They serve different purposes, and that's a bit of a fine scale difference with a couple of the portions. But I think as I described today, they're kind of for different audiences. And in particular, they are attempting to achieve different goals. The scope of work is much more focused on how the project is going to be achieved, whereas questions 1 through 4 in particular have much more to do with the broader setting that the project is placing itself within. All right, and then I've mentioned a number of times today our websites. Our main grants webpage for our pest management grants is located at www.cdpr.ca.gov/dprgrants.htm. And within there, you're going to find a ton of information on both the research and alliance grants. And one resource I haven't talked about yet that I would encourage people to review is our list of past funded projects. And we have that for both our research and alliance programs. We get a lot of questions on things like, do you guys fund this type of project? And those questions are really well answered by comparing some of your ideas to things we funded in the past. I would say that's definitely not a comprehensive list of what type of project we would fund, and oftentimes represents more of the applicant pool that we receive. So for example, you'll see a high percentage of University of California projects in there, and that has largely reflected the fact that we get quite a few applications from the UC system. So for any non-UC applicants that might be looking at that and feeling discouraged, definitely don't. We like to see novel, unique projects addressing aspects of integrated pest management from all different sides. And if you have any further questions that aren't answered easily by the materials found at our website, please get in touch. You can get in touch with essentially myself or the Alliance Grants Program lead, Dr. Tori Wiesenor, who's on the call with us today. We both monitor this email listed here, dprpmgrants.solicitation@cdpr.ca.gov. That's a great way to get a hold of us and ask any questions that you might develop as you're developing your materials. All right, so I believe we have about 20 minutes left today that we can address any further questions. And if you guys have questions on the scope of work, I'm happy to answer them. If you have questions beyond what we've talked about today, we can also address those. But I would say if people have maybe questions about the topics we've discussed today, if we could put those at the front end, and then maybe get to some questions concerning the proposal process more broadly once we're done with any scope related stuff. And let me know if you'd like me to return to any slides or talk more specifically about any of the points that I've mentioned today. So with that, I'll open it up for any questions, and feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself if there's a little bit of a lull, or drop a question in the chat. Any of those are great ways to let me know. Well, it might not be necessary to limit ourselves to only scope questions. Not seeing a ton yet. So if anyone does have really any question concerning our proposal application process or the grants program as a whole, feel free to dive right in. Yeah, James.
Hi, sorry, I didn't want to monopolize the questions.
No, you're good.
But according to the topics today, I wanted you to go back, if possible, to the thing about co-PIs and why those were not preferred, or so maybe you could expand on that, why it is that you prefer not to have co-PIs on the grant.
Yeah, so a couple notes here. This mostly is for our backend definition. If you want to, on your end, refer to yourself as co-PIs while using a different structure on DPR's end, we're fine with that. But it really comes down to, we like to have a single person in charge of a number of these processes, and that is largely, again, the admin and financial management pieces here. We like to have one person that's responsible for signing invoices and one person that's responsible for preparing the quarterly and annual reports. We find when those tasks get too far distributed and there's a little more nebulous of a sense of ownership there, it can be a little more difficult to get things done on time and with consistency.
Got it. And so I guess the alternative would be you would have a PI and then you have different senior personnel or key personnel.
That would work beautifully. And we even sometimes do see a team list that, say, has a PI and then co-PIs who are listed as co-PIs, but essentially function just as key personnel. That can work. Again, we'd prefer that you just list those folks as key personnel. But again, if you want to refer to them in any sort of documentation, or I know that this is a thing that can be important to, say, a CV that people are developing, we're comfortable with, as is appropriate as your team would consider it, people being listed as co-PIs beyond the structure of what is listed in the proposal.
Thank you.
Good question. A topic that we hit a couple times this cycle, I feel like. So you're definitely not the only one with that question. All right, excellent. Any other questions? Anything on the personnel topic while we're on it, or any of the other facets here more broadly? And James, I'll actually mention, I think at this point, our other non-DPR attendees have dropped off the call. I am going to stick around until 11, but if you have any further questions, definitely don't hesitate, because I think you're our remaining potential applicant here.
Okay, great. Let's see. I think this is pretty clear. And then all of the previous ones, because we kind of went into this process a little bit late, those can be found on the website, right? Including recordings of the previous presentations?
Yeah, so I'm going to go back to that slide, and then everything is very easily found from here. So from that main DPR grants webpage, there's very clear links to the research and alliance grants pages.
Okay.
And then if you click through to either of those, there's a list of the sessions, and essentially for future sessions, they will be links to the Zoom meeting. But then for the past sessions, you'll see a link to a YouTube video and then a PDF. And the PDF is of the slide deck, whereas the YouTube video would have essentially everything.
That sounds great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. All right, DPR folks, I'm going to hang out until 11, but I understand if other people want to get on with their day. Thank you all for tagging along.